Hello and welcome back to part 3 of this Antichrist series. In the 2 previous videos, we've seen how the prophet Micah foretold how the end times Antichrist would come from Assyria. And we also looked at Daniel chapter 2, the dream image of Nebuchadnezzar, which revealed the Gentile nations from Egypt all the way to the 8th world empire of the Antichrist just before the return of the Messiah. We saw how Daniel chapter 7 also mentioned the Antichrist kingdom through Daniel's vision of 4 great beasts. In this video, we will look at the prophet Isaiah and how he also pointed us to a Middle Eastern end times Antichrist world power. A little context on the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is known as one of the major prophets. The major prophets are described as major because of the longer lengths of their books, not their significance. The minor prophets of the Bible are shorter books with more specific content compared to the broader subjects of the major prophets. The 4 major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The 12 minor prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The book of Isaiah is 66 chapters in length. The book of Isaiah is divided into 3 sections. Chapters 1 to 35 comprise mainly of a series of condemnations against sin and declarations of God's judgments to follow. Chapters 36 through 39 are mainly historical rather than prophetic in nature. They deal with King Sennacherib of Assyria's invading of Samaria, and Hezekiah's illness and recovery, and the visit of Babylonian envoys. These chapters are parallel to accounts found in 2 Kings chapters 18 through 20. Isaiah chapters 40 through 66 constitute the most important part of Isaiah's prophecy. In these chapters, the message of the prophet is completely changed in tenor and theme. Declarations of judgment are largely in the past, and the rest of the book deals with promises of God's blessings upon the blameless. Therefore, it is mainly chapters 40 to 66 that have gotten Isaiah the name of gospel prophet. So in the last section of Isaiah, Isaiah writes about the glorious future of Israel as God's faithful servant, the salvation from every enemy, the approaching of the Messiah, and the founding of the Messianic kingdom. Isaiah was married to a prophetess. They had 2 sons whose names had prophetic meanings. Isaiah is widely regarded as one of the greatest prophets of the Bible. His name means Yahweh is salvation. Jewish tradition says that he was of royal descent, and he may have been a cousin to King Uzziah. This may have given him access to the kings of Judah in Jerusalem. He began his ministry in Judah around 740 BCE, in the year that King Uzziah died. Some 2 decades before Assyria invaded and conquered the 10 northern tribes known as the nation of Israel. The prophet witnessed the final years of Israel's spiritual decline and the utter disaster that followed, and God called him to warn the tiny nation of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem, about a similar outcome. When called by God to prophecy, he responded with a cheerful readiness, though he knew from the beginning that his ministry would be one of fruitless warning and exhortation. Having been reared in Jerusalem, he was an appropriate choice as a political and religious counselor to the nation. Isaiah is quoted directly in the New Testament over 65 times, far more than any other Old Testament prophet, and mentioned by name over 20 times. Also, there are more prophecies of the coming Messiah in Isaiah than any other book except the book of Psalms. The biblical account in chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Isaiah says he received visions from God during the reigns of the 4 kings of Judah, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. The time covered is from the end of King Uzziah's reign to the Assyrian king Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem. It was at least a 40-year ministry during the last half of the 8th century BCE. During Isaiah's lifetime, the nation of Assyria was the predominant power in the Middle East. In 721 BCE, Assyria had captured Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel, and deported the Israelites to other lands. Isaiah apparently lived in Jerusalem, the capital city of the southern kingdom of Judah, and he and his nation soon had to face the ruthless and cruel Assyrian Empire as well. Because of the sins of the people of both Israel and Judah, God said he was using the Assyrian as the rod of my anger and the staff in whose hand is my indignation, as Isaiah 10 verse 5 says. After the fall of the northern kingdom, Judah became a vassal state to Assyria. When Judah rejected Assyria's authority, King Sennacherib of Assyria brought troops to the region and took several Judean cities. The Assyrian monarch then turned his attention to Jerusalem. During this time when King Sennacherib was trying to conquer Jerusalem, God twice used Isaiah to send messages to Hezekiah, king of Judah. As the attempted siege of Jerusalem began, God had Isaiah tell King Hezekiah not to worry about the Assyrian invasion because the Assyrian leader would hear a rumor and return to his own land where he would die. This account is mentioned in Isaiah 37, verses 5 through 7. It says, "So the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, and Isaiah said to them, 'Tell your Lord this. This is what Yahweh says. Do not be afraid because of the words you have heard with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he will hear a rumor and will return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land.'" The Assyrians then sent a letter to King Hezekiah in which they blasphemed God and made further threats against Jerusalem. After Hezekiah took the letter to God and beseeched him in prayer, God sent a second message through Isaiah, letting King Hezekiah know that he, God, would defend the city. That's in Isaiah 37, 36 through 37. It says, "The angel of Yahweh went out and struck 185,000 men in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men arose early in the morning, behold, all of them were corpses, dead men. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed, and went away and returned home and lived in Nineveh." God's call on his people through Isaiah was to put trust in him rather than in military alliances with other surrounding pagan kingdoms. But time and again, Samaria and Judah didn't listen or trust in Yahweh's protection, and so both nations were taken into captivity by the Assyrian and the Babylonian world powers. However, God made a promise to the nation that a future king would one day deliver them. God's promise was that a military leader would be born from the line of David, who would deliver all of God's people from the Assyrian. The problem, however, is that this never occurred in history. The Assyrians decimated the northern kingdom of Israel and took most of its inhabitants away into exile in 722 BCE. But as for the promised Messiah who would defeat the Assyrian in a military battle, this is an entirely prophetic message that is still to occur yet in the future. Many Bible scholars have concluded that the term the Assyrian, while used historically to refer to the various kings of Assyria, is also a clear reference to the Antichrist, who will be defeated by Jesus when he returns. Then in chapters 13 through 23 of Isaiah, after prophesying the coming judgment against the Antichrist, we are given a list of many of the nations that will be destroyed or judged with him when the Messiah comes to bring the promised victory to his people. This then is the background and context of the book of Isaiah, which we will examine in this video. Many Christians are surprised to find out that the fuller context of the Old Testament prophets refer to Messianic prophecies and revolve around the theme of the conflict between Jesus and the Antichrist. Consider, for instance, the following passage in Isaiah. Untold thousands of Christmas cards, Christmas plays, sermons, and narratives have centered around this verse in Isaiah 7:14, where it says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Immanuel." But rarely does anyone continue reading the passage to discover its original context. If they did, they would soon learn that this prophecy is actually referring to an event that occurred in Isaiah's day, when a young woman bore a child and named him Immanuel. This child was to be a prophetic sign concerning the looming invasion of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrian armies. According to Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible, the name Immanuel was given to a child born in the time of King Ahaz. It was meant as a sign to the king that the southern kingdom of Judah would be given a reprieve from attacks by the northern kingdom of Israel and Syria. The name was symbolic of the fact that God would demonstrate his presence through the deliverance of his people, referring to the southern kingdom of Judah specifically. It's generally agreed that a larger application existed as well, that this was a prophecy of the birth of the Son of God, Jesus, the Messiah. So this prophecy had two fulfillments, one in Isaiah's day and another through Mary and Jesus. You see, the word used in this prophecy that is most often translated as virgin doesn't always necessarily mean someone, a maiden who has never had sexual relations. Rather, the Hebrew word used here, Alma, most literally refers to a very young girl who was most often not yet married and was thus a virgin. In Mary's case, of course, she was truly a virgin. But in the case of the first Alma in Isaiah's day, she, Isaiah's wife, both conceived and gave birth through entirely natural means. After this young girl gave birth to her Immanuel, Isaiah explains what signs would follow in Isaiah chapter 7, 15 through 20. Here it says, "He will eat butter and honey when he knows to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you abhor will be forsaken. Yahweh will bring on you, on your people, and on your father's house, days that have not come from the day that Ephraim separated from Judah, the king of Assyria." Verse 18. "It will happen in that day, Yahweh will whistle for the fly that is in the uttermost part of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. They will come and will all rest in the steep ravines, and in the clefts of the rocks, and in all the thorn bushes, and in all the water holes. In that day the Lord will shave with the razor that is hired in the parts beyond the river, even with the king of Assyria, the head and the hair of the feet, and it will also sweep away the beard." Isaiah here says that before the child Immanuel grows up, the king of Assyria would invade the northern kingdom of Israel. The graphic descriptions of the shaving the head, beards, and legs of the Israelites is an indication of the abasement, the complete humbling, and ultimately the enslavement that God was bringing to the northern tribes of Samaria through the Assyrians. The point in citing this passage is to show that as soon as the famous Messianic Immanuel prophecy is introduced, the Assyrian or the king of Assyria is also brought into the picture. Again, the events described in this passage refer to real historical events that occurred in Isaiah's day. Yet the historical king of Assyria was merely a type of the Antichrist, the ultimate prophetic invader of Israel. Throughout Isaiah's prophecy, we will see this same Messiah versus Assyrian theme repeated several times. Nearly the whole of chapter 8 centers around the coming invasion of Israel by the Assyrian. Isaiah 8, 7 through 8 says, "The Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria and all his glory. And it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks, and it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land." But then in chapter 9, once again, we're informed of God's ultimate solution. For it is there that Isaiah gives us what is unarguably the most famous messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. This is Isaiah 9, 1 through 7. This is the REV version, under the heading The Coming Messiah. "But there will be no more gloom for those who are in anguish. In the former time he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. But in the latter time he will make glorious the way of the sea, the other side of the Jordan, and Galilee of the nations. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Those living in the land of the shadow of death, on them the light has shined. You have enlarged the nation. You have increased their joy. They rejoice before you as with joy in harvest, as men rejoice when they are dividing up the spoil. For the yoke of their burden and the staff of their shoulder, the rod of their oppressor, you have broken as in the day of Midian. For every boot of the tramping warrior in the noisy battle, and the garments rolled in blood will be for burning, will be for fuel for the fire. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty Hero, Father of the Coming Age, Prince of Peace." Verse 7, "Of the greatness of authority and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and sustain it, with justice and with righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of Yahweh of armies will do this." Here in verse 6 in Isaiah chapter 9, it's obviously referring to Jesus Christ. Here in the REV translation, this verse is correctly translated. However, most Bible translations turn this verse into a verse that teaches the Trinity by calling Jesus the mighty God. The Trinity was born with the Roman Catholic Church way back to the time of Constantine the Great, who forced the Church to accept the Trinity teaching. Sadly, many Bible translations have been written with Trinity biases within their pages. This passage in Isaiah 9:6 is one example of an incorrect translation, and one which most Bibles still have in them today. The problem comes from an incorrect understanding of two Hebrew words. The Hebrew words translated as mighty God in Isaiah 9:6 are the Hebrew words El and Gibor. One must be careful not to be confused about which word is being translated as mighty in various translations. This subject is a lengthy one, which I really don't have time to get into in this video. I do plan in the future on addressing many popular Trinitarian Bible verses, but I won't be getting to that for a while. But for now, please see this following resource to see why this verse in Isaiah is not teaching that Jesus is Almighty God. There's a channel, I've recommended him before. I strongly recommend that you write this down and find this channel on YouTube. It's called The Trinity Delusion. A brother named Kel, K-E-L, is a Canadian brother. He does a fantastic job addressing verses like Isaiah 9:6 because he was a Trinitarian for a large part of his life. His whole channel is devoted to verses like Isaiah 9:6 and John 1:1 and other verses that Trinitarians use. So here's a direct link to his YouTube video on Isaiah 9:6 here. I'll paste it up right here. Also, Brother Cal has an article online here in written form, so you can go there and copy that article if you like for your personal study. Here's the link for that. Or if it's easier, just go to Google and search the Trinity Delusion and then type in whatever verse you want to look up. In this case, just type in the Trinity Delusion, Isaiah 9:6, and all this information should come up for you. So make sure you check out his channel, and specifically on this Isaiah 9:6, so you can get a clear understanding of that verse. He explains it really well. He does a much better job than I ever could, so please do that, and meanwhile we'll move on to Isaiah here. The passage in Isaiah 9 declares that the Messiah will deliver Israel from the Assyrian in the same manner that Gideon delivered Israel from the Midianite armies as recorded in Judges chapter 8. There is a fascinating connection here to the last days Islamic armies. A bit of history is necessary here. After having defeated the Midianites, Gideon's men implored him to rule over them, but Gideon's response was to refuse this position as it belongs to Yahweh alone. Then Gideon made a request in response. He asked the Israelites to give him the golden earrings and pendants that were on the necks of the defeated armies. That account is in Judges 8:22 through 24, where it says, "Then the men of Israel said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, even you, and also your son, and also your son's son, for you have saved us out of the hand of Midian.' But Gideon said to them, 'I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you.' Then Gideon said to them, 'I have a request to request of you. Give me each of you an earring from his plunder.' For they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. Though Abraham had more sons than just Isaac by Sarah and Ishmael by Hagar, he also had 6 sons by Keturah, his wife, after the death of Sarah. His 6 sons from her were Zemran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And Genesis 25, verse 2 mentions that. The Midianites were descendants of Midian and therefore also children of Abraham. Anyway, getting back to Gideon in Judges chapter 8, it's very interesting that Gideon asked for the ornaments to be given him from the earrings of those Ishmaelites and also the gold ornaments from around their camels' necks. The verse mentions the ornaments were in the shape of crescents. So these ornaments were shaped like crescent moons. Judges 8:26. The weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescents, and the pendants and the purple clothing that was on the kings of Midian, and besides the chains that were around their camels' necks. So the Bible tells us that the final victory of the Messiah over the Assyrians would be similar to the historical victory of Gideon over the Ishmaelites. Then, when we examine this victory, we see that Gideon, a type of Messiah, is seen stripping crescent moon ornaments off their necks. The crescent moon, of course, is the very symbol of Islam, featured prominently on Muslim flags, as well as on top of virtually every mosque throughout the earth. When Jesus returns and defeats the invading and persecuting Islamic armies of the Antichrist, he will likewise remove the symbols of Islam and idolatry from among the nations. Let's discuss these crescent moons for a moment here. In the 1940s, archaeologists G. Caton Thompson and Carlton S. Kuhn made some amazing discoveries in Arabia. They found thousands of inscriptions from walls and rocks in northern Arabia have been collected. Reliefs and votive bowls used in worship of the daughters of Allah have also been discovered. The three daughters, Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, are sometimes depicted together with Allah, the moon god, represented by a crescent moon above them. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that the dominant religion of Arabia was the cult of the moon god. South Arabia's stellar religion has always been dominated by the moon god in several variations. Many scholars have also noticed that the moon god's name is Sin, is a part of such Arabic words as Sinai, the wilderness of Sin, so forth. When the popularity of the moon god waned elsewhere, the Arabs remained true to their conviction that the moon god was the greatest of all gods. While they worshipped 360 gods at Kaaba in Mecca, the moon god was the chief deity. Mecca was in fact built as a shrine for the moon god. Archaeological evidence reveals that the temple of the moon god was active even in the Christian era. Evidence gathered from both North and South Arabia demonstrate that moon god worship was clearly active even in Muhammad's day and was still the dominant cult. According to numerous inscriptions, while the name of the moon god was Sin, his title was Alila, which means the deity, meaning that he was the chief or high god among the gods. As Professor Kuhn pointed out, the god Il or Ilah was originally a phase of the moon god. The moon god was called Alila, the god, which was shortened to Allah in pre-Islamic times. The pagan Arabs even used Allah in the names they gave their children. For example, both Muhammad's father and uncle had Allah as part of their names. The fact that they were given such names by their pagan parents proves that Allah was the title for the moon god even in Muhammad's day. Professor Kuhn goes on to say, similarly, under Muhammad's tutelage, the relatively anonymous Ilah became Aliyah, the god, or Allah, the supreme being. This fact answers the questions, why is Allah never defined in the Quran? Why did Muhammad assume that the pagan Arabs already knew who Allah was? Muhammad was raised in the religion of the moon god, Allah, but he went one step further than his fellow pagan Arabs. While they believed that Allah, i.e. the moon god, was the greatest of all gods and the supreme deity in a pantheon of deities, Muhammad decided that Allah was not only the greatest god, but the only god. In effect, he said, look, you already believe the moon god, Allah, is greatest of all gods. All I want you to do is accept the idea that he is the only god. I'm not taking away the Allah you already worship. I'm only taking away his wife, his daughters, and all the other gods. This is seen from the fact that the first point of the Muslim creed is not Allah is great, but Allah is the greatest, i.e. he is the greatest among the gods. Why would Muhammad say that Allah is the greatest except in a polytheistic context? The Arab word is used to contrast the greater from the lesser. That this is true is seen from the fact that the pagan Arabs never accused Muhammad of preaching a different Allah than the one they already worshipped. This Allah was the moon god according to the archaeological evidence. Muhammad thus attempted to have it both ways. To the pagans he said that he still believed in the moon god Allah. To the Jews and Christians he said that Allah was their god too. But both the Jews and the Christians knew better, and that is why they rejected his god Allah as a false god. Archaeologists have uncovered temples to the moon god throughout the Middle East, from the mountains of Turkey to the banks of the Nile. The most widespread religion of the ancient world was the worship of the moon god. Many Muslims have turned away from the religion of Islam once they know that their religion comes from this pagan moon god. Soon I will do an entire video on this moon god Sin upon which Islam is based, so stay tuned for that. So that's a little history on the moon god Sin, where Islam comes from. The second interesting connection here is seeing that the word used for crescent ornaments in Hebrew, Saharonim, It is a word closely related to Sahar, which is used later in Isaiah chapter 14, a passage where Yahweh refers to Satan as Lucifer, son of the morning star. Then only a few verses later we see that he will crush the Assyrian in my land. On my mountains I will trample him down. This is also precisely the same picture as painted in the book of Revelation, where Jesus is portrayed as crushing the Antichrist and his armies in the valley of Jezreel, also referred to as winepress of his wrath. In other words, the picture painted is of God gathering the armies of the Assyrian into one location where he will squish them like grapes. So despite the numerous references throughout Isaiah to the Messiah destroying the king of Assyria in the land of Israel, historically this deliverance never occurred. Instead, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, took numerous cities in Judah and laid siege to Jerusalem, according to 2 Kings 18 through 19 and parallel passages in 2 Chronicles 32. The angel of Yahweh did kill a number of Assyrian soldiers, but this cannot be that which Isaiah so frequently speaks about for the following reasons. Number 1, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, was not killed in the land. Number 2, the victory was not carried out by the Messiah. And 3, Assyria's chipping away of Israel and Judah was eventually followed by Nebuchadnezzar, who left Judah virtually desolate. In Sennacherib's day, the prophesied deliverer did not come. The yoke was not shattered. And thus scholars agree that Isaiah's theme of the coming Messiah, who would destroy the Assyrian, is a reference to the future when Jesus the Messiah will deliver the Israelites from the invading armies of the Assyrian. Throughout the prophecy of Isaiah, God is repeatedly calling on his people not to place their trust in natural political alliances, but rather to simply trust in him. Like the situation in ancient Israel, so also in the future, Israel will actually rely on the natural political alliances, treaties, and false promises of peace. Israel will accept the covenant made with the Antichrist. The Bible supports that in Daniel 9:27, where it says, "He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator." But then the Antichrist will renege on his agreements and will invade the land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel. The Lord, through Isaiah, rebukes Israel severely for making this treaty, which he calls a covenant with death. Rather than trusting in the Messiah, the tested cornerstone, Israel will instead trust in the peace agreement. The result will be their being invaded and beaten down by this Assyrian world power. That's confirmed in Isaiah 28:14 through 18, where it says, "Therefore hear the word of Yahweh, you scoffers that rule this people in Jerusalem, because you have said, we have cut a covenant with death, and with Sheol are we in agreement. When the overflowing scourge passes through, it will not come to us, for we have made lies our refuge, and we have hidden ourselves under falsehood." Verse 16, "Therefore this is what the Lord Yahweh says, Behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone of sure foundation. He who believes will not act hastily. I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line. The hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters will overflow the hiding place. Your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. When the overflowing scourge passes through, then you will be trampled down by it." Then, after God has finished with his redeeming work of chastisement towards his people, he will then punish the Assyrian. Isaiah 10:12 says, "When Yahweh has finished all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes." Continues on down in verse 16. It says, "Therefore the Lord God of hosts will send a wasting disease among the Assyrian stout warriors, and under his glory a fire will be kindled like a burning flame, and the light of Israel will become a fire, and his Holy One, Messiah, a flame. And he will burn and devour his thorns and his briars in a single day. Now it will come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and those who have escaped will never again rely on one who struck them," speaking of the Assyrian there, "but will truly rely on the Lord and the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea, only a remnant within them will return." A destruction is determined, overflowing with righteousness. For a complete destruction, one that is decreed, the Lord of hosts will execute in the midst of the whole land. Therefore, O my people who dwell in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrian who strikes you with the rod and lifts up his staff against you, the way Egypt did. For in a very little while my indignation against you will be directed to their destruction. After this work is complete, after the surviving remnant of Israel has returned to God and repented of their reliance on the Antichrist and his false promises, Isaiah informs us that the remnant of the house of Jacob would no longer rely on him whom struck them down. Isaiah 10, verse 20 says, "In that day the remnant of Israel, the survivors of the house of Jacob, will no longer rely on him who struck them down, but will truly rely on Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, a remnant of Jacob will return to the mighty God. Though your people, O Israel, be like the sand by the sea, only a remnant will return." In conclusion, then, as we have seen, whether it be the prophecy of Immanuel to come in Isaiah chapter 7 or the Prince of Peace in Isaiah chapters 9 and 10, in all these passages the fuller context is the coming of the Messiah to break the Assyrian Antichrist coalition at his second coming. The prophet Ezekiel also deals with this end times Antichrist Middle Eastern invasion in Ezekiel the 38th and 39th chapters. Ezekiel also points us to the specific nations of the Middle East who will comprise the Antichrist end times government. We will take a look at Ezekiel's prophecy in my next video, so stay tuned for that, and thanks very much for watching.